The transition back to civilian life was never supposed to be this difficult. After 12 years of military service, including 3 combat tours, I had prepared myself for challenges. But no training manual covers how to live with persistent pain from a spinal injury, or how to quiet the memories that transform ordinary sounds into threats in the middle of the night. My name is Michael Hendricks, and when I returned home with a Purple Heart and a medical discharge, I discovered that the hardest battles were still ahead. Doctors called it post-traumatic stress disorder, but clinical terms do not capture what it feels like to startle at every car backfire or to avoid crowded spaces because the press of bodies triggers panic. Living in my small apartment in the city became its own form of torture. The constant noise from neighbors, traffic sounds penetrating thin walls, and the claustrophobic feeling of being surrounded made sleep almost impossible. Simple tasks like grocery shopping became overwhelming missions requiring careful planning and quick execution. The idea of moving somewhere quiet first came from my VA therapist. She suggested that natural environments could help reduce symptoms, and mentioned animal therapy programs showing promising results for veterans like me. That night, I researched rural properties within my budget and discovered studies confirming what she had suggested: open spaces, routine animal care, and connection to nature could provide healing in ways medication alone could not. For 6 months, I searched while living on my disability benefits and modest savings. Each property I viewed was either too expensive or too remote from necessary services. Hope began to fade until I spotted a listing that seemed impossible: 15 acres with a small ranch house priced well below market value. Located just outside the growing town of Meadow Ridge, the property bordered both rural countryside and a newer suburban development. The real estate agent explained the price was low because the previous owner had needed to sell quickly. I walked the land feeling a sense of possibility for the first time since coming home. The house needed work, but the sturdy barn and fenced pastures were perfect for the small animal sanctuary I envisioned. That afternoon, I submitted an offer, and 1 month later, I held the keys in my trembling hand. After years of chaos and confined spaces, I finally had room to breathe. Moving day brought a feeling of profound relief. I unpacked boxes in a house where no neighbors shared my walls, where sirens would not wail through the night, where I could see stars instead of streetlights. That first evening, I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the open sky, planning renovations and researching rescue animals that could become part of my healing journey. What I did not know then, what the real estate agent had conveniently failed to mention, was that 5 years earlier, the Meadow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association had expanded its boundaries through a controversial land annexation. My peaceful sanctuary, my chance at recovery, technically fell under the jurisdiction of one of the most restrictive HOAs in the county. As I drifted to sleep that night in my new home, I had no idea that my peaceful sanctuary was about to become a battlefield of a different kind. Not all wars, as I was about to discover, are fought overseas. 2 weeks into renovating my new home, I began to feel a sense of purpose again. Each morning brought progress: fixing loose boards on the porch, repainting rooms in calming colors, clearing overgrown areas to make space for therapeutic gardens. The physical labor helped quiet my mind. For the first time since my medical discharge, I slept for more than 4 hours without nightmares. My plans expanded as my strength returned. The empty barn could house rescue horses and perhaps a few goats. The fenced pasture offered safe space for animals that, like me, needed rehabilitation and gentle care. On a Tuesday morning, I was measuring the barn doorway for repairs when a sharp knock interrupted my work. Opening my front door, I found a woman in her mid-50s wearing a tailored pantsuit that seemed out of place in these rural surroundings. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe bun, and she carried a leather portfolio and clipboard. "Good morning," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I am Patricia Miller, Compliance Officer for the Meadow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I see you have begun improvements to the property, and I wanted to welcome you to our community and ensure you have our regulation guidebook." I stared at her in confusion. There must be some mistake. This is rural property outside the subdivision. Actually, no mistake at all. She handed me a thick 3-ring binder. "Your property was incorporated into our jurisdiction during the boundary expansion 5 years ago. All 15 parcels along this road are now part of Meadow Ridge Estates and subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." Opening the binder revealed hundreds of pages of regulations. My stomach tightened as I skimmed sections prohibiting livestock, requiring approval for any exterior modifications, restricting fence heights, and mandating specific landscaping standards. Everything I had planned for my recovery violated multiple rules. "This property is zoned agricultural," I explained, hearing the tension in my voice. "I purchased it specifically to create a small therapeutic animal sanctuary as part of my treatment for service-related disabilities." Patricia tilted her head slightly. "I understand you are a veteran, Mr. Hendricks, and we thank you for your service. However, the zoning classification is superseded by our covenants that all property owners agree to upon purchase." She pointed to a signature page. "Your real estate closing documents included acceptance of these terms." I explained that my doctor had prescribed animal-assisted therapy for managing PTSD symptoms, describing how caring for rescue animals would provide structure and purpose during my recovery. As I spoke about my combat injuries and the recommended therapeutic environment, her expression remained unchanged. "Military service, while admirable, does not create exemptions from community standards," she stated flatly. "Our regulations exist to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. The board expects full compliance within 30 days. After she left, I called my real estate agent, who reluctantly admitted knowing about the HOA jurisdiction but not mentioning it because he did not think it would be strictly enforced on outlying properties. A call to the county offices confirmed the boundary expansion had indeed occurred, though the clerk mentioned it had been controversial at the time. That evening, I read through the entire binder of regulations. No livestock, no structures visible from the road, no fences exceeding 4 feet in height, no exterior modifications without prior written approval, which could take up to 90 days, no vehicles parked outside overnight except in garages, no business activities, including animal sanctuaries. The list of prohibitions seemed endless. Sleep evaded me that night. The property I had purchased to heal had become a trap. The mortgage commitment meant I could not easily sell and start over elsewhere. My limited disability income left no room for fighting legal battles. Yet abandoning my plans for recovery seemed equally impossible. The quiet property had already begun to work its healing magic, and returning to city apartment living would mean surrendering to the symptoms that had nearly destroyed me. As dawn broke, I made a decision. There had to be reasonable accommodations for medical needs. Before facing combat situations, we gathered intelligence and planned carefully. This unexpected battle with the Meadow Ridge HOA would require the same strategic approach. The difference was that this time, I was fighting for my chance to heal. The legal aid office occupied a small suite in the county courthouse building. The attorney who reviewed my case, Gabriella Morales, specialized in housing discrimination and fair housing laws. She listened intently as I explained my situation, occasionally taking notes or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned forward with a serious expression. The Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act both provide protections that may apply here, she explained. Homeowners associations must provide reasonable accommodations for disabilities, including modifications to rules that would otherwise prevent you from having equal opportunity to use and enjoy your dwelling. She advised documenting everything, every conversation, every letter, every violation notice, and obtaining a formal letter from my doctors detailing the medical necessity of animal therapy and rural living environment. Armed with this information and a folder of relevant legal precedents, I prepared to attend the monthly HOA meeting scheduled for the following evening. The community center room fell silent when I entered. Approximately 30 residents sat in folding chairs facing a table where 5 board members presided. I recognized Patricia Miller, the compliance officer, sitting beside an elegant woman whose nameplate identified her as Karen Whitehall, board president. The agenda listed me under new business as property compliance issues at 1876 Meadow Road. When my turn came to speak, I stood and introduced myself, explaining my military background and resulting disabilities. I described how my doctor had prescribed animal therapy and a peaceful rural environment as essential components of my treatment plan. Several residents nodded sympathetically as I requested a reasonable accommodation under federal disability laws. "While we respect your service," Karen Whitehall responded without a moment of consideration, "Meadow Ridge Estates has clear standards that all residents must follow. Our property values depend on consistent enforcement of these standards." "With all due respect," I countered, "federal law requires reasonable accommodations for disabilities. I have documentation from medical professionals stating the therapeutic necessity of my planned animal sanctuary." Karen tapped her manicured fingernails on the table. "Our legal counsel advises that maintaining 2 rescue horses does not constitute a reasonable accommodation, particularly when our covenants explicitly prohibit livestock. If we make an exception for you, where would it end?" For 30 minutes, the discussion continued, with Karen dismissing each point with rehearsed talking points about community standards and property values. Other board members remained silent except to occasionally nod in agreement. As the meeting concluded with no resolution, I noticed several residents avoiding eye contact with board members as they approached me. "Do not give up," whispered an elderly man as he passed. "They did the same to my daughter when she wanted to install a wheelchair ramp." "Check the original incorporation documents," suggested another resident discreetly. There were irregularities with how they annexed the rural properties. Over the next week, 3 neighbors visited my property under the guise of welcoming me to the area. Each shared stories of selective enforcement and intimidation tactics used by the current board, particularly against properties at the rural edges of the development. One neighbor, Robert Chen, explained that Karen Whitehall owned a real estate development company that had recently purchased land adjacent to the rural properties. She considers the larger lots underdeveloped assets that interfere with her vision for luxury condominiums, Robert explained. Several owners have sold after persistent harassment over minor violations. The violation notices began arriving 3 days after the meeting. The first cited my gravel driveway as non-compliant with approved surfaces. The second demanded removal of a temporary storage pod I had rented during renovations. The third claimed my mailbox design violated aesthetic standards. Each notice threatened daily fines after a 7-day grace period. I photographed identical violations on properties within the main subdivision that had received no citations: gravel driveways, storage containers, similar mailboxes. The selective enforcement pattern became increasingly obvious as two more violation notices arrived, one objecting to a trellis I had installed for climbing vegetables, and another claiming my grass exceeded the maximum allowed height by half an inch. When I called Patricia Miller to discuss these discrepancies, her response was telling. The board has discretion regarding enforcement priorities. Your property is highly visible from Lakeside Drive, which is considered our community gateway. That evening, I watched through my window as Corinne Whitehall's luxury SUV drove slowly past my property, stopping briefly as she photographed my front yard with a telephoto lens. The realization dawned with absolute clarity. This was not about rules or community standards. This was a systematic effort to force out certain property owners through harassment and financial pressure. The vacant lots and larger properties along the rural edge were being targeted by someone with personal financial interests in their development potential. As I organized the growing file of violation notices and documentation, my military training kicked in. When facing a determined adversary, understanding their strategy and motivations becomes essential to survival. This was no longer just about my recovery. It was about standing against calculated injustice. Despite the growing pressure from the HOA, I moved forward with the first phase of my therapeutic animal sanctuary. Working with a local rescue organization, I arranged to adopt two horses slated for euthanasia: a gentle mare named Luna with a damaged leg that had healed improperly, and an older gelding named Sergeant who had been abandoned after years of service giving riding lessons to children. The rescue coordinator mentioned that both animals would likely be put down if not placed within the month, as the organization faced space limitations. On the day they arrived, something extraordinary happened. As I guided Luna from the trailer, her ears perked forward and she nuzzled my shoulder gently. That simple moment of connection sent a wave of calm through my body unlike anything I had experienced since returning from deployment. Sergeant followed cautiously, his eyes watchful but trusting. Getting them settled in the barn and fenced pasture required hours of physical work that left my body tired but my mind surprisingly clear. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without medication and without nightmares. The responsibility of caring for these animals provided the structure and purpose my therapist had described. Their presence required me to establish routines, feeding schedules, exercise periods, health checks, that anchored my days in productive activity rather than isolation and rumination. The HOA response was swift and calculated. 3 days after the horses arrived, a certified letter from their attorney threatened daily fines of $100 for unauthorized livestock. Anonymous complaints began flooding the county zoning office, claiming I was operating a commercial horse boarding facility without proper permits. My security cameras captured board members driving by multiple times daily, slowing to photograph the property and animals. Patricia Miller appeared at my door unannounced, clipboard in hand and accompanied by another board member who recorded our interaction on his phone. "We have received multiple complaints about odors and noise," she stated, though the immaculate barn and quiet animals clearly contradicted these claims. "The board has authorized immediate enforcement action if the animals are not removed within 48 hours. I showed her the documentation from my doctors and the legal information about reasonable accommodations, explaining that caring for these specific rescue animals was part of my prescribed treatment plan. Her dismissive response revealed their strategy. "You are welcome to pursue any legal challenges, Mr. Hendricks, but during that process, the daily fines will continue to accumulate. Local media became interested after I contacted them about the situation. A reporter from the Meadow Ridge Gazette interviewed me about my military service, my medical discharge, and the therapeutic purpose of the animals. The resulting article, titled "Disabled Veteran Fights for Healing Space," included photographs of the well-maintained property and rescue horses, generating supportive comments online from community members outside the HOA boundaries. The board's response to the growing public attention showed their desperation. Karen Whitehall issued a press statement describing the HOA as protecting community standards against commercial agricultural activities in a residential zone, and claiming that the matter was simply about following agreed-upon rules that maintain property values for all residents. Then came the most shocking escalation of all. On a quiet Thursday evening, as I finished the horses' evening feeding, 3 police cruisers with flashing lights sped up my driveway. Officers emerged with hands near their weapons, approaching cautiously as I stood frozen beside the corral. The lead officer called out that they had received reports of dangerous animal activity and illegal commercial operations. As they questioned me in my front yard, neighbors emerged from their homes to watch the commotion. Through the gathering crowd, I spotted Karen Whitehall observing from her parked luxury SUV across the street, a satisfied expression visible even at this distance. The public humiliation felt familiar, the same sense of being judged and found wanting that had accompanied the worst moments of my transition to civilian life. The officer's demeanor shifted rapidly as I explained my veteran status, showed them my Purple Heart and documentation about the therapeutic purpose of the animals. Their professional assessment confirmed no danger existed and no laws were being broken. The senior officer pulled me aside before leaving. "Sir, I apologize for the disruption," he said quietly. "We respond to all calls, but this appears to be a civil matter between you and the HOA. I would document this incident if I were you." As the police vehicles departed and curious neighbors returned to their homes, something fundamental changed inside me. The months of accommodation and compromise gave way to determination and resistance. That evening, I emailed Gabriela Morales requesting more aggressive legal representation and began researching the HOA's formation documents and boundary expansion process. That night, sitting on my porch watching Luna and Sergeant graze peacefully in the moonlight, I made a decision. My military training had taught me that sometimes the best defense is a strategic offense. The HOA board, particularly Karen Whitehall, had escalated this conflict to a public spectacle intended to force my surrender through humiliation and financial pressure. They had miscalculated badly. After facing insurgents and surviving combat injuries, I would not be intimidated by neighborhood bureaucrats with agendas. For the first time since purchasing the property, I felt the familiar clarity that had carried me through combat situations, the focused determination that comes when the path forward becomes unmistakably clear. This conflict had evolved beyond my personal accommodation. It had become about exposing systematic abuse of power that affected an entire community. Sleepless nights became productive as I channeled my military training into methodical research. The county clerk seemed surprised when I requested access to all HOA formation documents, boundary amendments, and meeting minutes for the past 7 years. For 3 days, I reviewed hundreds of pages, creating detailed notes and photographing key documents. What emerged was a pattern of procedural irregularities that raised serious questions about the legitimacy of the boundary expansion that had incorporated my property. The critical annexation 5 years earlier required signatures from 2/3 of affected property owners. Several signatures appeared identical, and 3 property owners later submitted affidavits stating they never approved the expansion. More significantly, the final boundary map submitted to the county differed substantially from the version presented to homeowners during the voting process, encompassing additional parcels including mine. My investigation expanded to the county business registry. Karen Whitehall served as CEO of Whitehall Development Group, which had purchased adjacent land through a subsidiary named Meadow Ridge Partners, LLC. This created an undisclosed conflict of interest in her enforcement actions against rural property owners. Public records revealed her company had submitted preliminary plans for luxury condominiums that would require access through several of the disputed properties, including a corner of my land for a proposed entrance road. Robert Chen introduced me to 4 other homeowners facing similar harassment. Each owned larger parcels at the development edges, and each reported escalating violations beginning shortly after Whitehall Development acquired the adjacent properties. We created a shared document tracking all violations, noting the selective enforcement patterns and timing of escalations following resistance to board demands. Armed with this growing evidence, I scheduled a consultation with Diana Washington, an attorney specializing in homeowners association law. Her office walls displayed numerous certifications and awards for advocacy in housing discrimination cases. As she reviewed my documentation, her professional demeanor gave way to visible interest. "This is quite extraordinary," she commented, examining the boundary amendment discrepancies. HOAs operate under specific legal constraints despite their perceived power. The procedural irregularities in the boundary expansion alone create significant vulnerabilities in their enforcement authority over your property. She explained that HOAs derive their power from properly executed contractual agreements. If the boundary expansion failed to follow legally required procedures, their jurisdiction over the annexed properties could be invalidated entirely. Additionally, the undisclosed conflict of interest potentially violated state laws governing HOA board conduct. Beyond these issues, the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act provide powerful protections, she continued. Reasonable accommodations for documented medical needs must be granted unless they create undue hardship, which would be difficult for them to prove given the rural nature of your property. For the first time since the nightmare began, I saw a path forward. Diana outlined a multi-pronged strategy, formally requesting accommodation under federal disability laws, challenging the validity of the boundary expansion, filing ethics complaints regarding the undisclosed conflicts of interest, and preparing for possible litigation if necessary. "Document everything," she emphasized. "Every conversation, every letter, every board meeting. Install security cameras if you have not already. Create a timeline of all interactions and enforcement actions." She also suggested organizing affected homeowners to attend the next board meeting, explaining that public scrutiny often tempers aggressive enforcement actions. Before leaving her office, I scheduled a follow-up appointment and agreed to gather additional evidence of selective enforcement. That evening, I created a secure online folder where affected neighbors could upload their documentation, violation notices, and photographs of similar violations that went unenforced in other areas of the development. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. Properties along the boundary targeted for development faced aggressive enforcement, while similar violations throughout the main subdivision received no citations. As I organized this growing evidence, I felt a sense of purpose stronger than any I had experienced since leaving military service. This was not just about securing an exemption for my property. This was about exposing systematic abuse of authority that affected an entire community. The skills that had once served me in combat, strategic thinking, intelligence gathering, coalition building, now served a different mission, bringing accountability to those who had weaponized rules against vulnerable homeowners for personal gain. The formal accommodation request arrived at each board member's home via certified mail on a Tuesday morning. Diana had crafted a comprehensive 15-page document citing specific protections under the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. It included letters from my doctors detailing the medical necessity of animal therapy and rural environment for managing PTSD and physical injuries sustained during service. The request concluded with clear notification that denial would result in formal complaints to federal housing authorities and potential litigation. Simultaneously, I executed the second phase of our strategy. 7 homeowners, each facing similar targeted enforcement, agreed to attend the next HOA meeting together. We prepared concise statements documenting the pattern of selective enforcement and questioning the legal validity of the boundary expansion that had incorporated our properties. The third component involved public accountability. A reporter from the Meadow Ridge Gazette who had covered my initial story agreed to publish a follow-up piece examining the HOA's enforcement patterns. After reviewing our documentation, she expanded her investigation to include public records revealing Karen Whitehall's development company and its plans for the adjacent property. The resulting article, published 3 days before the HOA meeting, raised serious questions about potential conflicts of interest and selective enforcement targeting specific properties. Community response surpassed my expectations. My email inbox filled with messages of support from residents throughout Meadow Ridge and neighboring communities. Several local veterans offered to attend the HOA meeting in solidarity. A community Facebook group titled Support Veterans Healing Ranch gathered over 500 members within 24 hours. The HOA board's initial response came through their attorney, a formal letter rejecting our accommodation request and threatening increased enforcement actions. Diana immediately filed for an emergency injunction to pause any fines or enforcement pending resolution of the legal issues. She also submitted a public records request that uncovered financial irregularities in HOA accounts, including consulting fees paid to a company registered to Karen Whitehall's husband. On the evening of the HOA meeting, I arrived early to find the community center parking lot already filled. Inside, every seat was taken, with additional residents standing along the walls. Many wore military veteran caps or T-shirts. As I entered, several people nodded in silent support. Karen Whitehall called the meeting to order with visible discomfort at the unprecedented attendance. When public comments began, she appeared startled as 27 residents had signed up to speak, most regarding enforcement issues and boundary questions. Her usually composed demeanor cracked as speaker after speaker questioned the board's actions and motives. Robert Chen presented documentation showing his property had been cited for violations identical to uncited properties owned by board members. An elderly woman described receiving violation notices the day after refusing to sell her corner lot to a developer. A retired attorney questioned the legal validity of the boundary expansion process. When the board attempted to adjourn without addressing the mounting concerns, Diana Washington stood and formally requested the floor. Citing HOA bylaws that required addressing properly submitted agenda items, she effectively forced the board to acknowledge our concerns or violate their own procedures in front of witnesses. Karen's response revealed her desperation. "This meeting is being hijacked by a coordinated effort to undermine community standards," she declared, voice rising. "The board will review all concerns and respond appropriately at a later date." As the meeting dissolved into heated exchanges, I noticed several board members whispering urgently to Karen. The community had witnessed the board's refusal to address legitimate concerns, and the public perception had clearly shifted. When the meeting finally adjourned, numerous residents approached me with additional accounts of selective enforcement and intimidation tactics. The true measure of the board's desperation became apparent 3 hours later. As I completed evening chores in the barn, emergency vehicles with flashing lights once again appeared at my property. This time, the responding officers explained that Karen Whitehall had called 911 claiming I posed a threat to community safety following the confrontational meeting. She alleged I had made threatening statements and exhibited erratic behavior consistent with PTSD episodes. The officers, including one who had responded to the previous false complaint, quickly recognized the situation for what it was: an attempt to intimidate through official channels. The senior officer asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint regarding the false police report. "We take false emergency reports seriously," he explained. "This appears to be a pattern of harassment." I requested they document the incident but declined to press charges immediately, explaining our strategy involved documenting a pattern of behavior. They completed their report, with one officer commenting quietly before leaving, "My brother served 2 tours in Afghanistan. What they are doing to you is disgraceful." That night, security cameras captured Karen Whitehall and 2 other board members driving slowly past my property around midnight, stopping briefly before continuing. The escalation to false police reports demonstrated both their desperation and willingness to exploit my veteran status and disability in their campaign of harassment. Their tactical error proved catastrophic to their cause, as the responding officers had witnessed firsthand the peaceful nature of my property and recognized the report as malicious. As I reviewed the security footage, I felt surprisingly calm. The board had abandoned any pretense of legitimate enforcement and entered territory that exposed them to personal liability for harassment and potentially criminal charges for filing false reports. Their actions had united the community against them and strengthened our legal position immeasurably. With growing community support and mounting evidence, the path to resolution was becoming clearer. The HOA board had initiated this conflict, but I would determine how it ended. The false police report triggered an emergency court hearing. Judge Elena Martinez reviewed our documentation of ongoing harassment, including police reports, security footage, and witness statements. Her expression grew increasingly severe as Diana presented evidence of selective enforcement, procedural irregularities in the boundary expansion, and Karen Whitehall's undisclosed business interests. "The pattern of targeted harassment described here is troubling," Judge Martinez stated. "Particularly concerning is the apparent exploitation of Mr. Hendrick's veteran status and disability in what appears to be a systematic campaign of intimidation." The courtroom fell silent as she issued a temporary restraining order, prohibiting the HOA from any enforcement actions against my property pending full legal review. She also ordered preservation of all HOA documents related to boundary expansions, enforcement actions, and board communications. "This court takes a dim view of using governance structures as weapons against homeowners," she concluded, "particularly when those actions appear targeted at individuals entitled to accommodation under federal disability protections." Local news coverage of the court hearing transformed the narrative. Headlines described HOA overreach against disabled veteran and Judge halts HOA harassment campaign. Karen Whitehall's carefully crafted public image crumbled as reporters investigated her development company's connection to the targeted properties. Former board members came forward with accounts of pressure to enforce violations selectively against properties blocking planned development. The community response exceeded anything I could have imagined. A neighbor established an online legal defense fund that reached its $15,000 goal within 48 hours, eventually exceeding $25,000 with donations from across the county. Veterans groups organized a weekend volunteer event to help with barn repairs and property maintenance. Local businesses donated materials and services, turning what had been a solitary struggle into a community cause. Facing mounting public pressure and potential personal liability, the HOA board agreed to settlement negotiations. Karen Whitehall notably absent, represented by counsel only. The resulting agreement exceeded our initial requests. Complete exemption of my property from restrictive covenants regarding animals, agricultural use, and outbuildings. Establishment of clear accommodation procedures for future residents with disabilities. Independent audit of HOA financial records and boundary expansion procedures. Resignation of board members involved in documented harassment. Monetary settlement covering legal expenses and damages. 1 month after the settlement, Karen Whitehall resigned from the board facing separate ethics investigations related to undisclosed business conflicts. The development plans for luxury condominiums were withdrawn, and the property sold to a conservation trust, establishing a permanent green buffer between suburban and rural areas. By summer, my small animal sanctuary had expanded thoughtfully. Luna and Sargent were joined by 2 rescue goats, a retired therapy dog, and 3 chickens rehabilitated from an animal hoarding case. The barn, once the center of controversy, now featured accessibility modifications allowing other disabled veterans to participate in animal care activities. The first veteran support group meeting in the renovated barn drew 15 participants, former service members struggling with similar transition challenges. Watching them interact with the animals, seeing tension visibly leave their bodies, confirmed everything my doctors had prescribed about the healing power of this environment. The reformed HOA, now led by Robert Chen and other community-oriented residents, worked collaboratively with homeowners. They established reasonable guidelines that respected property rights while maintaining community standards, demonstrating that these goals need not conflict when approached with good faith and proper respect for individual circumstances. 1 year after the settlement, I hosted an open house celebration for the officially named Second Chance Ranch. Over 100 community members attended, including several former board members who had privately opposed the harassment campaign but feared speaking out. Judge Martinez attended briefly, commenting that this case had changed how she viewed homeowners association disputes. The county subsequently adopted ordinances requiring disclosure of business interests by HOA board members and establishing clearer procedures for boundary expansions. Several neighboring communities revised their own HOA bylaws to include explicit accommodation procedures for disabilities and limitations on enforcement authority. As evening fell and the celebration wound down, I found a quiet moment to reflect while watching Luna and Sargent grazing peacefully in the pasture that had nearly been lost. What began as a personal battle for accommodation had evolved into something far more significant, standing against arbitrary authority and creating space for healing beyond myself. The most meaningful outcome appeared each Thursday evening, when the veteran support group gathered in the barn. Watching these men and women find moments of peace through connection with animals and each other reinforced a profound truth. Sometimes the most important battles we fight are not for territory, but for the right to heal. In creating this sanctuary, we had not just defended a property. We had established a community understanding of the difference between rules and justice, between enforcement and compassion, between living alongside one another and truly being neighbors.